See. All right. Well, welcome to Solar Noon Tuesday, everyone. My name is Jay Warmke with solarpvtraining.com. And if you're not familiar with this format, what we do is we try and recap what's happening in the world of solar for the last week or so, just the headlines. Then we're going to go ahead and update you on any events that are going forward and webinars, in-person events. And then we're going to tackle a deep dive into a subject that I find of interest to the solar industry. Hopefully you do too. This week, what we're going to be doing is tackling the Floatovoltaics. So basically solar on water. I had a request last week or the week before that we address this topic, so we're going to do so. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into what's happening in the world of solar for the week of March 16th. The Environmental Protection Agency has terminated grant agreements worth about $20 billion that were issued under the Biden administration under a green bank program designed to finance clean energy and climate-friendly projects. The Green Bank program was part of a 2022 IRA climate law. The idea was to create a nationwide version of government-backed nonprofit green banks that now operate in about 17 states. These offer low-cost loans or grants for rooftop solar, for efficiency retrofits of buildings, electric heat pumps, EV electric charging, things of that nature, any similar carbon-cutting projects. The law had given the EPA $27 billion to grant to states, tribes, nonprofit groups, and public-private consortiums. Those grantees, in turn, could then turn around and lend that money or grant that money to projects and initiatives across the country while bringing in private sector funding to try and expand the reach of that government leveraged funds. In April of last year, the EPA picked 8 coalitions to receive the money. In order for a project to get money from this fund, they must comply with the Build America, Buy America Act, which requires that certain federally funded projects must use iron, steel, manufactured products, construction materials that have been produced in the United States. The projects must also follow very complicated data reporting requirements, and their loan and investments must simultaneously reach out to hard-to-reach communities or underinvested communities. And they also have to earn enough return that these can be reinvested back into future projects, all at the same time attracting private funding to contribute to the projects as well. Now, as a result of all of these requirements, very little of this money has actually been awarded to projects. The termination of the agreement comes weeks after the EPA froze the grants. And EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin claimed that this whole program was marred by conflict of interests and potential fraud. Defenders of the program argue that the money was awarded and the government entered into legal contracts with these organizations who are charged with administering the funds, and that there was no evidence presented at all as to what this fraud or abuse might entail. They also claim that the action by the Trump administration is simply a breach of contract. So the move is being appealed, of course. And then if you're confused about what the ongoing budget negotiations, the budget resolution means to the IRA tax credits, you're not alone. And I must say, I did quite a lot of research on this, and I still am not really 100% sure what the heck they're talking about. But the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act established a base tax credit for renewable energy projects of 30%. Which means that the homeowners or the business developers, the solar project developers, can deduct 30% of the cost of their project from their federal tax bill. Additionally, commercial developers can deduct an additional 10% if the project is located in a low-income area or an area that's referred to as an energy community, which is a community that has historically relied on fossil fuels as a significant portion of the employment within that district. And then there was an additional 10% if you use domestic product, if product used or developed or created here in the United States. Now, these tax credits were set to phase out beginning in 2032. So it was a 10-year project. But many Republican lawmakers have targeted these tax credits, claiming that they'll reduce receipts to the Treasury by as much as $1 trillion over the next 10 years. And they want to use those revenues to offset the cost of expanding and extending the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which is projected to reduce revenues to the Treasury by as much as $4 trillion over that same period of time. Now, the narrative got a little bit more confused when last week 21 GOP lawmakers came out publicly to oppose the wholesale revoking of the IRA tax credits in that reconciliation bill. They stated that countless American companies have utilized the sector-wide energy tax credits to make major investments in domestic energy production and infrastructure in both renewable and traditional energy sources. And they expressed concerns that because we're seeing an elevated level of demand coming over the next few years, that without these tax credits, we would not have the supply to meet that demand, and that we would see an energy crisis as a result with rapidly escalating energy costs. The Clean Economy Works IRA two-year analysis. This was a report study that was just conducted about how the IRA is working by a group called E2, found that Republican districts have benefited substantially from the tax credits. Now, according to this report, nearly 60% of all of the announced projects, 85% of the money awarded, and 68% of the jobs are located in Republican congressional districts. And what's more, data from the IRS and the U.S. Treasury Department shows that these are being utilized quite a lot by a lot of taxpayers. In fact, 3.4 million Americans took advantage of the renewable energy tax credits in their 2023 tax returns. And to put on top of this, these are quite popular with the American people. In fact, a poll late last year found 87% of those surveyed are in support of federal tax credits to support the development of solar and battery storage. And that includes 78% of those folks who said they voted for President Trump in the 2020 election. So quite a lot of bipartisan support there. Now, more than 50% of all residential solar PV systems installed in the U.S. currently incorporate N-phase microinverter systems. So the products that they integrate and support have kind of an outsized impact on the residential solar market in this country. For several years now, N-phase has been announcing that there's a bidirectional EV charging unit just around the corner, that it's coming. Well, it appears that it is still just around the corner, that it's coming. So Enphase recently announced they're going to be shipping their new IQ EV Charger 2 unit to 14 different EU markets. The EV charger is a smart charger, and it is designed to work with their solar system as well as their battery systems. Or as a standalone charging unit. And it features a lot of self-consumption technology, as well as ways of lowering your energy costs by monitoring time of use pricing and things of that nature. But it does not include bidirectional charging. They state that it is equipped with hardware and software that will support AC bidirectional charging, but that this is dependent upon EV compatibility, standards, as well as local certifications, which basically means until the automobile manufacturers, the standards bodies, and local governments get their act together, then bidirectional charging is still just a concept. And I would further add that it means that all of this stuff about being ready for it is nonsense, because how can you be ready for something that you have no idea what it's going to entail? So again, vaporware coming there, no surprise. And a study by the British Trust for Ornithology looked at the impact of solar development on bird populations. They found that solar farms resulted in greater numbers of bird species and more birds overall than the surrounding cropland. According to the study, a number of species in these mixed habitat solar farms were about 2.5 times higher than nearby farmland. The study also showed that solar farms offer important habitat for a number of threatened bird species. The mixed habitat solar farms that were surveyed contained many of the landscape features that birds do find attractive, such as hedgerows, tall and diverse vegetation on the ground surrounding the panels that provide cover, nesting sites, as well as food sources for the birds. And that is the news from the solar industry for this week. Does anybody have any comments? Just somebody asking about a link for that bird study. I think it's the British Ornithology. If you just look it up on Google, that will save me time and effort, which is the whole point of this, of course. So anybody else have any questions, any comments on the solar news?
I read a thing the other day where the REAP grants were frozen along with all the other funds, and so people who'd already contracted for the REAP grants and also had committed and even had purchased the hardware were being frozen out of being able to access to the grant.
Yeah, I read that as well. And I mean, I'm doing REAP assessments and they're still having us do them. So, there's no word that the program is impacted in any way other than the federal government is just not paying their bills. That's, I don't know how to read that. If they do pay their bills, then obviously it's just a delay. But if they don't, that's problematic because a lot of people have spent many tens of thousands of dollars with the expectation that you're going to get reimbursed. So I don't know. Anybody, do you have an additional comment on that, Bill?
Well, the question is how is that different from a shutdown?
You could say that we're doing an assessment. They do that periodically anyway with the REAP. They don't say how quickly they're going to reimburse. They just say they're going to assess it. So if they come back and you could reasonably say, listen, we got a new team in here. We want to look at things for 30 days. I don't think that's what they're doing. They're just trying to make life miserable, I think. But if they come back and say, we're not paying, you would think that's simply breach of contract and it wouldn't hold up in court. But stranger things have happened, I guess. It probably put some businesses out of business for sure. Any other questions or comments before we move on a little bit? All right. Well, let's go ahead and talk about the announcements of what's coming up in the world of solar. Okay, so there's on March 16th through the 19th, there's a Solar and Wind Finance Conference in Phoenix, Arizona. Again, I will mention that the times for these webinars and the like are going to be Eastern time. And I haven't put links or anything on all of these, but I'm at least making you aware of it. You can Google them. Hopefully you'll be able to find them. March 20th, 2 p.m., webinar on energy storage. This is CCI. I think CCI stands for Community Solar, Commercial, and Industrial. So it's basically those larger scale systems, but not utility scale. Virtual power plants, 3 p.m., demystifying commercial scale virtual power plants at 3 p.m. That's an area that's going to be more and more important as we start to see a lot of these virtual power plants emerging, whether they're combined electric vehicle, once we get into bidirectional. That's going to be important. And at some point, I think we're going to see virtual utilities, which is a whole nother world. March 24th, 7 p.m., Solar United Action Hour. So they're trying to motivate people to contact their representatives to try and promote solar. So that's something you can tie into. March 25th at 8:30 a.m., There's a session here on essentially grid demand growth. How are we going to be dealing with this? I think there's a lot of fossil fuel input on that, which, it's good to know just to find out what they're saying, even if you don't agree with it. March 24th through the 27th, Distributech in Dallas, Texas. That's an in-person conference. And at the same time, NABCEP is having their conference in Reno, Nevada. That's really geared more towards the installers, of course. Then Solar United Neighbors is having another coffee chat on the 27th at 11:30 a.m. I think that's just an informal Zoom session. See about upcoming legislation. April 1st, using software tools. This is through Solar Power World. And then Homeowner Trends, also through Solar Power World on April 3rd at 2 p.m. Again, if you're selling these systems, this might be good to see what are the trends in your customer base. May 19th through the 22nd, Clean Power will be held. This is a conference in Phoenix, Arizona. And then, of course, our shameless plug for all of our in-person and online courses at solarpvtraining.com. So my wife always says I have to add that since she's our marketing person and I'm terrible at it. So, all right. So anybody else have any events, anything of that nature, any announcements you have regarding the wonderful world of solar? Before we jump into our deep dive, give you just a second.
Hi, everybody. This is McKenna with the Montana Renewable Energy Association.
Hey, McKenna.
Hi. Sharing just a little bit of good news in Montana. We have cleared a major hurdle for community solar enabling legislation at the state level. So we've cleared the Senate with a really great vote, and we're working on passage through the House and then eventually to our governor's desk. So just opening the opportunity for more consumers to go solar, even if they're a renter or if they can't do solar on their own property. Opening up that subscription style solar that had prior not been accessible to most Montanans. So we're excited about that. We're moving and shaking. Thought I'd share a little good news amidst all the uncertainty.
Okie dokie. Yeah, and just in case you're not familiar with the community solar model, it's essentially that you can buy into a larger project and then have that allocated towards your electric bill. A lot of homes are not suitable for solar, whether it's you're a renter and you don't want to invest in the property, or it doesn't face the proper direction, or the roof isn't there, or it's shaded, or, there's a whole host of reasons. McKenna, does this legislation target low income folks? A lot of times there's provisions for that as well.
Ours does not. We're leaving all the rulemaking to the Public Service Commission and allows for equitable access among all rate classes. So I could see that coming in future sessions if we can get this first one across the finish line.
Okay. Yeah. And those states that do allow or basically require the utilities to allow community solar becomes quite a popular option. The rub is that the utilities do have to be complying with this because obviously if there's a solar array located at another location, they need to then allocate its production to your bill. So the utility has to be involved there. Okay. Any other announcements or questions? Give me just a second. Thanks. All right. Well, let me jump in here. We had the request last week or the week before to talk a little bit about photovoltaics, and this is one of those cute terms, sort of like agrivoltaics, where you incorporate agriculture with solar. Well, photovoltaics is basically when you put solar on top of water. And you would think at first blush, solar, electricity, water, not a good mix. But it turns out that this is a technology that's certainly viable and growing pretty dramatically. It has its problems. And it solves some problems, like almost every situation. So as I go through this, I'll tell you what I've researched on it, what I've found. But if you have comments or something to add, or questions, just jump on in, because one of the beauties of this format is a bit interactive, at least hopefully, ideally. So, all right. So what exactly is photovoltaics? Well, you can see in this image, they can be quite large. Typically, they're going to be on an inland water body, non-flowing water typically, and you locate this on that body of water. So you're using the water surface as the mounting site for the solar array. Now, why? Why would you do such a thing? Well, land is increasingly becoming scarce. We see here in Ohio, there's a conflict between farming and solar. Whether that conflict is real or perceived doesn't really matter. There's a conflict there. So solar does well when you have it in an open area, no shade, flat land, easily accessible to the grid. Well, that's also farmland, So developers logically go to the low-hanging fruit. So they try and keep their costs as low as possible. So they're taking some of this land that has other uses. So we're saying, okay, well, in the United States, we're blessed with a lot of land. So it hasn't necessarily been a problem. But if you're in a region of the US or another nation where high population density, very little flat, open land, then photovoltaics becomes more and more of an option. And many of these ponds where solar makes sense, or these water bodies, are kind of as they say, the aquatic field equivalent of a brownfield. A brownfield is basically a site that has been disturbed or polluted in some way, and now can be developed to use solar, for example, or some other use. So it wouldn't be good, wouldn't be suitable for farmland. So for instance, a good example might be an old strip mall or an old mall that nobody's going to anymore. That might be a good site for a solar array. An abandoned airport, an abandoned strip mine land, although I don't know if that'd be a brownfield. That might be considered a little bit worse. But land that's not really good for much else is often very suitable for solar. Well, water bodies, same thing, another opportunity. So what are some of the advantages of photovoltaics? Well, it doesn't take that land up. The land increasingly and always has been a scarce commodity. One of the investing maxioms is, they're not making any more of it. So land typically appreciates in value, becomes a bigger and bigger cost center. If you put the solar on panels or on water, they're going to be cool. The water, the coolness of the water will actually make those panels work better. They also prevent evaporation on that or retard some of the evaporation. They don't prevent it totally, but you will see that there is not as much water loss because you're covering that. It's condensing and it's staying within the water. It will also limit algae bloom because not as much sunlight is reaching the water. That can be a huge problem in some of these water bodies. It comes to mind for me here in Ohio, Grand Lake St. Mary, which was a water body that was developed, I guess, as part of the Erie Canal system. Very, very shallow, a pretty large lake. It receives a lot of the nutrients from nearby farmland washing in, a lot of the fertilizers. And it's a mess. It's green. It's full of algae. It would be a perfect candidate for something like this for photovoltaics, where you could minimize some of the sunlight that's penetrating and limit the algae bloom. It could provide habitat for like fish farms, for other aquatic life as it's cleaning it up. They do tend to help with some of that. A lot of the fish farmers like this. The panels stay cleaner. I'm not sure how great of an advantage that is, but yeah, it's an advantage. Oftentimes you can combine these systems with an existing hydro facility. So if you've got a dam and you've got a big reservoir there and you want to put solar on top of that, then you've already got all of the existing electrical infrastructure there because it is generating electricity. So you've got access to that transmission infrastructure. And some of the locations, like I know California over the last year or two or 5 or 10, has experienced extreme droughts. So the amount of energy that is being generated through these hydro systems is diminished because they don't have the same water levels. Well, you could augment some of that with photovoltaics so that you could level out your production a bit by, increasing production from the same facility. And they, not just for these hydro dams, but I've actually been approached myself for projects that are going to be going on at water treatment centers, sewer treatment centers, things of that nature. They have these ponds, they have that infrastructure. It's a good location for that power source. And then you can use the power at that facility because they're pretty heavy consumers of electricity as well, so they can use their existing infrastructure to as a platform to generate their own power, just like you might on the roof of a warehouse, or example, where you're going to use the power you're generating from your facility. So what are some of the criteria when you're going to install photovoltaics? Well, one of the things is it can't be that cold. You don't want the water freezing up. Ice and the like can cause problems for sure. So they do say when the government is evaluating a site, they'll say no monthly average temperature below minus 15 degrees Celsius. So that's just something you don't want. This is not a super cold weather situation. Also, it can't be navigable. So you're not wanting to put it in a river, for example, or someplace. If recreational sports fishing or the like is in this location, then you'd have to somehow cordon it off. But for the study that I'm about to reference, they just said no navigation on this lake. Depth of at least 1 meter. So essentially, they don't want these things drying up. You've got to have enough capacity there to float the system, and no current greater than 2 meters per second. So they were referring to inlet and outlet locations. So you don't want to put them right next to where the water is flowing. It wants to be pretty stable. And that, as a result, they said not closer than 50 meters from the dam at a reservoir. So this was the government's criteria when they were evaluating what kind of capacity exists within government-owned or publicly owned reservoirs to generate electricity. So just to give you a sense of the scale, is this practical? Does this thing really generate enough power to make sense? And so they did this study, and they created this particular map of the United States and where all of these publicly owned reservoirs that are suitable for photovoltaic, where they're located. And you can see the big centers are going to be there in Texas, Oklahoma, Southern California, throughout the Southeast. So there's some population centers around there for sure. Now, what they did say is that the capacity of these publicly owned reservoirs is about 862 gigawatts of capacity if they were all developed. Currently in the United States, we only have about 236 gigawatts of solar. So, it's a lot. A lot. In fact, I saw in one of my readings, I don't have double verification on it, but they said that 862 would be enough to handle about 50% of all of the energy needs that are perceived for the US for the foreseeable future here. So, photovoltaics could be a significant source of power. If we wish it to be. I saw another article that was talking about using the canal system in California, which would be technically photovoltaics, which could also power all of California if you just put these panels over top of the canal system there, the irrigation canal system. All right, so well, let me pause here. Any questions so far as we move forward on this? Anybody have a comment? Yeah, Bill, you've got a comment? Oh,
comment.
Okay. Um, I'm wondering, I mean, we've got probably 80% of our population that lives within 50 miles of the coast. And so we have some similar types of issues in terms of mounting systems close to the coast. And one of those is corrosion. And I know over sewer plants, you'd have ammonia and other types of vapors that would be coming off of the pond. I'm curious about corrosion and corrosion resistance, not just on the panels. And I know that some panels like REC has rated their panels for photovoltaics. But I'm wondering about struts and spars and mounting structure. How could they be done with fiberglass strut or beams? Those are the types of issues that I think would be really addressed.
Yeah, we did. They did note that, and you're correct. Obviously, corrosion is a big issue, especially if it were in saltwater environment. They were talking about most of the components that are being used are plastic in nature. PVC of some sort. Just because the metal components would tend to rust and corrode fairly readily, fairly dramatically. I know the panels have waterproofing issues. There are ammonia issues, things like that we have to address. So I will sort of get to that because there's always a downside. But these are things that need to be addressed. Let's see, Al, you had a question or a comment?
Well, I'm just going to wait. I think you'll get to this, but I'll just hold on.
Okay. All right. Well,
Comment?
so let me talk a little
Comment?
bit. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Ralph here. You had mentioned on a previous Zoom Tuesdays, putting solar panels over irrigation canals also have an additional benefit that they reduce evaporation. And with agriculture's shortage of water in the southern United States, that would be another benefit of photovoltaics.
Yep. I'm sure it definitely is. One of the advantages is the evaporation issue, the as we said, the shading issue for algae growth, keeping the panels cooler. All of those are good reasons for doing this. The question would be, does it compensate you enough for the added cost and the added maintenance issues? And for sure, I personally, as I was reading through it, when they did talk about some ocean or near shore systems, in saltwater, and I keep reading that with like, really? That seems like it's a harsh environment. I mean, these things are going to end up on somebody's front lawn, during a storm. So we'll take it with a grain of salt. Everybody who's selling something wants to tell you the advantages, don't necessarily want to tell you what could happen. So that's something that we just want to weigh this. I'm not advocating one way or the other. I'm just saying, hey, this is what's out there. We'll see.
How about as flotation when a detention pond has water in it and sitting on flat bottom when it's dry?
Yeah, they did mention about that too. That the pond could, as long as you're using like a float type system on pylons or whatever, pontoon type, where if it's a flat bottom and the pond evaporates, it's probably not going to damage the system. So that would work. But many times the bottoms of these ponds are going to be full of stuff that they want to avoid that happening if possible. But if it's a pure flat bottom, it shouldn't be a problem. Al, you had a question?
Yeah, this leads right into what I was going to say. And question is, there's probably a hybrid model here and it's being deployed fairly widely, I believe, in India, where evaporation of water from irrigation and even for canals that bring water to cities is a big issue. And I think what they're doing is they're actually mounting the support structure for the panels on the side of the canal. So they span the canal with panels, but they're not actually floating.
Yeah.
So it's really not floating. What do you want to call it? Floating voltaics, but
Floatovoltaics. Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of a hybrid system, and they're using it widely in India, from what I've read.
Yeah, I saw some pictures of that. I think it was a mock-up for California, where
Yeah.
you've got this sort of a concrete highway for water,
Yep.
and
That's
you
it.
could put this over the top of it, and clearly that's just a ground-mounted system that
Right.
happens to be over
Right.
water. There are some other variations. I got a couple of pictures here, and I'm not quite sure how practical they are. But another option would be to put pilings in the water. Just basically fixed mounts, and put that panel over top of the water, but anchored on piers that go through the water, and that's an option. But obviously, again, it's not floating. You're basically building a platform over top of the water. So that's another option. But the true photovoltaics is something that's going to normally be sitting on pontoons, basically. And then you can have the panels either resting right on those pontoons. Think of them like a ballasted system on a rooftop, only that ballasted system, instead of being concrete blocks and metal racking, are going to just be sort of a sculptured uh, barrel kind of thing, just a floating plastic item that's set to receive a panel. So that's one option. Or you can have pontoons that hold a rigid structure, metal rails and the like, but they're all attached to floating pontoons. So there are a couple of different options there. Each panel could float independently, say, or it could all be part of a rigid structure. Then, of course, well, let me jump in. I'll just show this picture up close. So you've got the modules on top of these floats or these pontoons. And then, of course, you've got waterproof wiring system of some sort. The whole system would be grounded into the probably under the water, just a regular grounding system, a combiner box of some sort to handle all of the wire management. All of these things would have to be watertight for sure. Some sort of central inverter. This one has that central inverter floating. I don't know, a lot of them, the pictures I saw there on the ground near. And then it goes to local, to your transformers. There are also anchor lines, more mooring lines, as they say here, and anchors at the bottom. Thinking about a lake like Grand Lake St. Mary, it's a huge, huge lake, but I think it only gets like 6 feet deep. That's one of the problems. So that's why it's so prone to algae. There's just not that much capacity of water. Well, a system like that wouldn't require a whole lot of anchoring, so I think a system like that might work very well. So this is kind of the way that you can think of it. This gives you an idea of what we're talking about. A couple of pictures here that this is the pontoon type, small system. I think this is actually from India. There's an interesting study by the World Bank that talks a lot about photovoltaics. Let's see, Al, I see your hand is raised. Is that from the last time? Or you got another comment? Oh, okay. All right, and so this just shows you like these would be individual panels just on individual pontoons, essentially. I found this one, which was very interesting. I'm not quite sure how practical it is. It might work nicely in an ocean environment, but what they've done here is they've put this circle here, and that's actually like a plastic sheet that's tightened within this circle. And then the panels, I'm assuming these are going to be non-silicon. They're going to be flexible panels, are mounted right onto that sheet and then generating the power that way. They seem to think there was a big advantage for this. I'm not quite sure. Obviously, it does. These things do lessen the impact of waves a bit. It sort of evens it out. Some of the downside they were talking about is that these things have to be towed out into place. They require, a little more infrastructure to manage than those smaller systems. But it's another idea that people are playing around with. So, so those are some of the advantages we've talked about. What are some of the disadvantages? Yeah, Ted just mentioned Lake Okeechobee in Florida is only 15 to 20 feet deep. Okay, so the high cost, these things do cost more, 20 to 50% more than comparable ground-mounted systems. There was a deep study into the economics of it that was performed by NREL, and they put that number at 26 cents a watt elevated cost, or 25% more than comparable ground-mounted systems. As was mentioned, corrosion, rust, that's a big issue. How do you avoid that? And high cost of maintenance. You go out there and you want to do some repairs or whatever, you're probably talking about boats and scuba gear and all these other things that normally in a photovoltaic maintenance routine you don't have to deal with. So that's going to add some costs. Then NREL also did a comparison here. They were just showing that with a ground-mounted system, you're usually dealing with steel or aluminum. With the floats, it's predominantly made of, and this is some sort of plastic type material. Wiring, regular electrical versus waterproof and marine grade electronic components and wiring. Pile-driven plus concrete foundation is what you would have in a typical ground-mounted system, or helical piers, screw-type mounts. This is going to have bottom anchoring with more lines. That's going to add a certain amount of cost to it. Then when you're getting ready for the site, there's site preparation. You've got geotechnical as well as ground leveling, grading. And then with floating, you've got, all of the hydro surveys that you got to have. And of course, the angle is going to be less with photovoltaics. It just simply, you couldn't have high profile angles there. I would guess they would tend to perhaps capsize. Who knows? Well, that's going to reduce some of your gain by putting them at a 10%. Although that's not that unusual an angle for rooftop ballasted systems. And then NREL further just put into perspective what the various costs are going to be. Obviously, with the structural, it's going to be a bit more. But they're putting that premium here. What's that, 26 cents? So as they said, about a 25% increase there. Obviously, the one thing that you don't have with photovoltaics is going to be the land acquisition costs. I'm assuming most of these systems are going to be in places where the water is either publicly owned or can be accessed for minimal costs. Downside, of course, these require specialized platforms, anchoring systems, marine grade. We already talked about those things. Some technological improvements that are out there that may enhance this in the future. Bifacial panels, if you raise them up high enough, you're going to get that reflectivity off of the water. That could be a big advantage. There are improvements in these floating platforms. A lot of the articles were talking about some of the technological advancements. They also have smart tracking systems. So you can sort of imagine if this system is floating on the water, it would be a lot easier to turn it, to track with the sun each day than perhaps a ground-mounted system because you're just spinning it in the water. And then there's improved waterproofing panels, as was mentioned earlier, ammonia-proofing panels, things of that nature. And you can also use these systems to monitor water quality, wind, weather patterns. I guess you can do that with regular ground-mounted systems as well, not the water quality, but the other environmental quality issues. So where does this make sense? Obviously it doesn't make sense everywhere, but it makes sense somewhere. And typically, you're talking about locations where there is a high cost of land and high demand for energy, for electricity. Currently, ground mounted utility scale systems take about 3.5 to 10 acres per megawatt. They are expecting the photovoltaic market here in the US to grow on an annualized rate of around 13%. And it was interesting to see. I could see California, Florida, New Jersey came up a lot. Like these are places, I guess there's a lot of water available there, and there's also high density of population. So land becomes more and more expensive. So those are some of the places. And as a result, if you're wondering where much of this development has happened, well, for the most part, it has happened in Asia Pacific. This just gives you a sense of it. It's a little bit hard to read, but you can see China, like everything else in this world of solar, is the big dog. But India, Japan, another one, about 90% of it is located in Asia Pacific. I found this diagram kind of interesting. In the early days, 2007 through 2012, much of the development was in the EU. You know, that seemed to be the birthplace of photovoltaics, and the Netherlands was specifically one that they cited quite a lot. And then China was a small player. The US was a relatively small player. Japan, relatively big. Then you go into sort of the mid years, 2013 through the 18th. Now we're starting to see Japan, the US, China starting to emerge. EU still a big player. Japan still a big player. The US, a little bit more, not so much. And then other countries, India beginning to emerge. And then, of course, over the last 5 years or so, China is dominating. China is dominating that. The EU still growing. The US still growing. As I said, about 13% a year. India growing as well. Other countries, certainly. When you start listing off the countries, in fact, I've got a diagram here that talks about what countries in 2022 were the biggest installers. China, the European Union, they've grouped it together and then broken it out. So as a group, it was in number 2, followed by the US, but then they also put the like Spain and Brazil in the EU, Spain and Germany, Poland. So India, number 3 there as far as what they're installing currently, and number 4 in cumulative capacity. So that would all make sense. Brazil's starting to emerge as a player as well. So that's where this is happening. And where is it going to continue to happen? Well, the projections from Wood Mackenzie here is that China is going to again dominate, but India is going to be a bigger and bigger player in this market. You start looking at Indonesia, of course, an island nation. That makes perfect sense. South Korea, they don't have that much land, but they definitely have population and energy needs. Vietnam, Thailand, Taiwan, Israel, yeah, that comes up. That surprised me a little bit. Malaysia, and then some of these other Southeast Asian nations like Laos. So those are, this is not something that's really U.S. centric here. This is something for areas that, again, have water sources and large populations and large electrical needs. Yeah, Bill, you had a comment?
Yeah, it appears to me that we're talking largely about countries that have a fairly high population density, where water availability could be an issue. Certainly Israel. We're talking about that with municipal water supplies, all over the United States. I'm thinking of Norman, Oklahoma, where the water reservoir is chronically drying up and is threatened. I think the evaporation advantages would be huge for some of these places. I also wonder about the possibility of using photovoltaics on things on a small scale, such as stock tanks, both to generate power as well as to keep the water from evaporating. There's all kinds of possibilities there as we get into waterproof and polymer solar panels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it makes sense too. We might see that because of all of the scarcity and tariffs on metal that we're seeing a lot, that polymer issues, it may be the go-to. Even for land-based systems, we may start to see a trajectory where a lot of our support structures goes to a plastic type thing because metal becomes just prohibitively expensive. So I could see that. And it occurred to me as you were speaking that desalination plants, seem like just a no-brainer for this kind of thing. You need a lot of power. You're going to be having water, you know, maybe something like that. So there are a lot of uses for it. But again, it's not a solution for everything. It's a solution for some things. We may find that, as you say, the water evaporation thing becomes the main driver, behind this. That may become the economic, straw that determines whether you go on that or the other. So, and then I just had this little sum up thing from the World Bank here. That talks about some of the advantages, some of the disadvantages, some of the issues, not really an advantage, but challenges, as they say. So if you look through here, the reduction of evaporation losses, for sure, that's a big advantage. Ease of deployment, I don't know. They put it as an advantage. I wonder, not so easy. No land required, for sure. That's nice. You've got this resource. It's not being utilized. We're using it as a storage of water. Why don't we use it as a generator of electricity as well? Possible soiling by birds. Well, you got that problem on land as well. I guess they're just thinking there's a lot more waterfowl around these, but that's an issue. Electrical safety and longevity. Yeah, well, water and electricity, what could go wrong? So, there's going to be some issue there. There's often a synergy with electrical infrastructure, for sure. If you've got a reservoir there, you've got a hydroelectric plant, something like that, you've already got the transmission infrastructure right there. So that's a good synergy. There is certainly water available for cleaning. That's for sure. Maybe even use some of that power to just, cool your panels and clean them periodically with a little mister or spray or who knows what. Reduction of algae growth, as I mentioned, Grand Lake St. Mary, that would be a big deal. That place is an algae bloom every summer. Increasing the energy yield because the panels are going to stay cooler. That's a nice thing. And then they have some of the challenges is the anchoring and mooring. Of course, that's a complexity that most solar arrays don't have to deal with. There may be an environmental impact because you're reducing the amount of light that goes into these systems. Just as it solves the problem of algae bloom, maybe it creates other problems, because now you've got this shaded environment. Who knows? Anytime you deploy anything at scale, you're going to create some problems. And then maintenance. Maintenance is going to be more complicated, very specialized in nature for sure, because much of it's going to occur underwater. So that was kind of a sum up from the World Bank. So we've got about 2 or 3 minutes. Any other comments here on this topic before we call it a day? Hopefully it was helpful, enlightening a little bit, at least to highlight some of the issues.
Yeah, Jay, would you consider looking at the comments? There's some comments there that might be an interesting add.
Okay, I'll do that. And Jay, while I'm doing that.
This is not just water-based, but in countries that have predominantly electric railroad, are railroad right-of-ways being used for mounting of solar and supplementing their electric for trains? And should we be looking at that in the U.S.?
Like any space for sure, is helpful. I did see an interesting project with railways where they were laying the panels between the rails. They actually had a specialized train that could drop panels on the tracks between the rails. So that was interesting. And then they had a special train that went over and cleaned them with brushes and the like periodically. So that's something, an underutilized space. I think as space becomes more and more of a premium, those kind of situations, uses become more and more economically viable. But obviously it requires specialized equipment. Any other comments here before we call it a day? I'm trying to look at the comments, but it's tough to. I'm not good at multitasking. What can I say? Yeah. All right. I think we're right out of time here, but I appreciate everybody's attention, and we will see you again next Tuesday at noon. All right. Take care.